A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart, Chapter 1, Borrowed Dreams. The scent of lavender and lies filled the morning air as Nora Whitfield stood before the full-length mirror in her borrowed bedroom. The reflection staring back at her was a stranger, hair pulled into an elaborate updo that had taken the pack's stylist 3 hours to perfect, makeup applied with the precision of someone preparing a doll for display, rather than a bride for love. 22 years of life, and this was supposed to be her moment. The day she finally belonged somewhere. Stop fidgeting. Vera Whitfield's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade wrapped in silk. Her aunt moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent 15 years as beta of the Crimson Veil pack, every gesture calculated for maximum impact. Alpha Carson expects perfection today. Nora's hand stilled on the pearl necklace. Another borrowed piece like everything else in her life. I'm not fidgeting, I'm just nervous? Good. Nervous means you understand what's at stake. Vera's reflection appeared beside hers in the mirror. Silver-streaked hair pulled back in her trademark severe bun. Her pale eyes, so different from Nora's warm brown ones, swept over her niece with the same critical assessment she might give a battle strategy. This marriage secures our alliance with the Moonridge pack. Blake is doing you an enormous favor. The words settled like stones in Nora's stomach. A favor. That's what her wedding was. Charity extended to the orphan girl who had nowhere else to go. She remembered the night Alpha Carson had brought her to this pack house, 14 years ago. 8 years old, covered in her parents' blood, shaking so hard she could barely stand. He'd knelt beside her with what she'd thought was kindness, and promised she would always have a home here. What he hadn't said was that the home came with a price, and today, she would finally pay it. The flowers arrived an hour ago, Vera continued, adjusting Nora's necklace with sharp, precise movements. White roses and baby's breath, just as Blake requested. The photographer is setting up in the Great Hall. Representatives from 4 packs will witness your vows. 4 packs, including their bitter rivals, the Shadow Peak pack, who had been invited as part of some political maneuvering Nora didn't fully understand. The thought of their alpha, Xander Blackmoon, watching her pledge herself to Blake, made her skin crawl with unease she couldn't name. Aunt Vera? Nora's voice came out smaller than she intended. Do you think Blake loves me? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Vera finally spoke, her tone held the patience of someone explaining simple arithmetic to a slow child. Love is a luxury, Nora. You've been fed, clothed, and educated by this pack for 14 years. Carson could have left you in that forest to die with your parents, but he didn't. He brought you home, gave you his name, raised you as his own daughter. Her fingers tightened on Nora's shoulders. This marriage is how you repay that debt. Blake needs a mate who understands loyalty, who knows her place. You're perfect for him. The words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt like a cage closing around her ribs. Nora had spent her entire adolescence watching Blake treat her with the casual indifference reserved for furniture. Present when needed, ignored when not. She'd told herself it would change after their mating ceremony, that the bond would bring them closer. Now, staring at her reflection, she wondered if she was deluding herself. Besides, Vera added, stepping back to examine her handiwork, what other choice do you have? You're 22 with no mate prospects, no particular skills, no family wealth. Blake is the future alpha of this pack. Marrying him makes you Luna. That's more than most orphans could ever dream of achieving. The reminder hit its mark. Nora was nothing without the Carson name, nothing without this pack's protection. She'd learned that lesson early, watching other orphaned wolves struggle on the fringes of pack society, never quite belonging, never quite safe. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Come in, Vera called. Blake Carson filled the doorway, and for a moment, Nora's breath caught. At 25, he was everything an alpha's son should be. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of effortless confidence that drew wolves to him like moths to flame. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his gray eyes sharp with intelligence, and when he smiled, it was the same charming expression that had convinced half the unmated females in their territory that they might catch his attention. None of them had. Only Nora, the convenient choice. "Don't you look beautiful?" he said. But his gaze swept over her with the detached appreciation of someone evaluating a business transaction. "The dress fits perfectly." Nora looked down at the wedding gown she'd be wearing in 3 hours. White silk that had cost more than most pack members earned in a year, with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light like captured stars. It was gorgeous, extravagant, and it felt like a costume for a role she wasn't sure she wanted to play. "Thank you," she managed. "You look handsome too." Blake's smile widened, though something flickered in his eyes too quickly for her to interpret. "I should let you finish getting ready. The ceremony starts at noon, and Father wants to review the vows with me one more time." He leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead, the kind of gesture that should have felt romantic, but instead felt like a blessing bestowed by a benevolent stranger. After he left, Vera resumed her preparations with renewed efficiency. Hairspray, lipstick touch-ups, a final adjustment to the dress's train. Each addition felt like armor being fitted for battle rather than adornments for celebration. "Remember," Vera said, as she fastened the final clasp on Nora's bracelet. "Smile during the ceremony. Look happy. The other packs will be watching for any sign of discord, any weakness they can exploit later." Nora nodded, practicing the expression in the mirror. Radiant bride, grateful mate, perfect Luna-to-be. The lies came easier with repetition. When they finally left the room, Nora's reflection lingered in the mirror like a ghost. In 3 hours, she would stand before the assembled packs and promise her life to a man who saw her as a political necessity. She would smile and play her part, just as she had every day for the past 14 years. But as she walked toward her wedding, something deep in her chest whispered a question that made her steps falter. What if there was another choice? The thought was treasonous, dangerous, and completely pointless. But it followed her down the hallway anyway, a shadow she couldn't shake. In 3 hours, Nora Whitfield would cease to exist. In her place would stand Luna Blake Carson, mate to the future Alpha, perfect political pawn. She just hoped the girl she was leaving behind wouldn't haunt her forever. Chapter 2. Shattered Vows. The great hall of the Crimson Vale Pack House had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. White silk draped the ancient stone walls, and thousands of white roses cascaded from every available surface, their perfume thick enough to make Nora's head swim. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the assembled guests. Representatives from 4 different packs, seated in carefully arranged sections that spoke to decades of political maneuvering. Nora stood at the back of the hall in her wedding dress, a masterpiece of white silk and French lace that had cost more than most wolves earned in a lifetime. The bodice hugged her curves perfectly, hand-sewn pearls catching the light with every breath. The train stretched behind her like a river of moonlight. So long it required 2 young pack members to carry it. She felt beautiful and terrified in equal measure. The traditional wedding march began, played by a string quartet flown in from the city. Every head turned as she began her slow walk down the aisle, Blake waiting at the altar in a midnight blue suit that emphasized his commanding presence. Alpha Carson stood beside his son, chest puffed with pride, while Vera watched from the front row with satisfaction gleaming in her pale eyes. Representatives from the Moonridge pack occupied the seats of honor, their alpha nodding approvingly as Nora passed. The alliance would be sealed with her vows, a political victory Carson had been pursuing for years. In the back section, she caught sight of the Shadow Peak delegation, 3 wolves in dark clothing who radiated danger even while sitting perfectly still. Their alpha, Xander Blackmoon, watched her approach with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. She forced herself to focus on Blake, on the future she was walking toward. He smiled as she drew closer, that practiced expression he wore at pack functions and business meetings. Everything about this moment was perfect, exactly as it should be. Halfway down the aisle, Nora stumbled slightly on her train. A small thing, barely noticeable, but Blake's smile flickered for just an instant. She saw something in his eyes then. Irritation, maybe disappointment. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But the seed of doubt it planted began to grow. Elder Morrison waited at the altar. the pack's spiritual leader whose authority stretched back 3 generations. His weathered hands held the ceremonial binding cord. Wolf hair twisted with silver threads that would symbolically unite their souls. Behind him, the full moon shone through stained glass windows, bathing everything in ethereal blue light. "Dearly beloved," Elder Morrison began, his voice carrying across the hall without effort. "We gather tonight under the blessing of the moon goddess to witness the sacred union of Blake Carson and Nora Whitfield." The formal words washed over her as Nora took her place beside Blake. His hand was warm when he took hers, steady and sure. She tried to find comfort in that steadiness, in the certainty of what came next. "Blake Carson," Elder Morrison continued, "do you take this woman as your mate, to honor and protect, to cherish and defend, for as long as the moon shall rise?" Blake's response should have been immediate, automatic. Instead, he hesitated, just for a heartbeat, but long enough for whispers to start in the back rows, long enough for Nora's stomach to clench with sudden dread. Blake's voice carried clearly in the hushed hall. He looked at Nora, then at his father, then back at her. Something cold and calculating had replaced the warmth in his gray eyes. "I need to say something first." Elder Morrison frowned. This wasn't part of the ceremony, wasn't in any tradition Nora knew. Around them, the assembled guests leaned forward, sensing drama unfolding. "Blake?" Alpha Carson's voice held a warning note, but Blake had already made his decision. He dropped Nora's hand and took a step back, creating distance that felt like a chasm opening between them. "I cannot take Nora as my mate," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "She has no true blood connection to this pack. She's an orphan we took in out of charity, nothing more." The words hit Nora like physical blows. Around her, the wedding guests erupted in shocked murmurs, but she couldn't process anything beyond Blake's next terrible words. "The Moonridge Alliance has been secured through different means," he continued, his tone businesslike, as if he were discussing trade agreements rather than destroying her life. "I will be mating with Alpha Moonridge's daughter instead. She carries true bloodlines, true power. Nora," he looked at her with something that might have been pity, "Nora is not worthy of becoming Luna of this pack." The great hall spun around her. 14 years of believing she belonged here, of thinking she had earned her place through loyalty and dedication, crumbled in an instant. The wedding dress that had made her feel like a princess now felt like a costume, a mockery of dreams she'd been foolish enough to believe could come true. Alpha Carson stepped forward, and for a wild moment Nora thought he might defend her, might argue with his son's devastating pronouncement. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Blake speaks wisely," Carson said, his voice carrying across the stunned hall. "True leadership requires difficult decisions. The Crimson Veil Pack will be strengthened by this choice." Betrayal crashed over her in waves. Not just Blake, but Carson too. The man who had called her daughter, who had promised her a home, who had raised her for this exact moment only to reveal it had all been an elaborate lie. Cameras flashed as pack photographers captured her humiliation for posterity. The wedding that was supposed to be her triumph had become her public destruction. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others coldly evaluating, all of them witnesses to her shame. Nora turned and ran. The wedding dress made it difficult, the long train catching on chairs and flower arrangements as she fled down the aisle. Behind her, voices rose in confusion and speculation, but she couldn't stop to care what they were saying. The great doors seemed impossibly far away, but she finally reached them and burst through into the cool night air. She made it to the garden before her legs gave out. Sinking onto a stone bench beside the fountain, she buried her face in her hands and tried to breathe through the crushing weight in her chest. Everything she'd believed about her life, her future, her worth, all of it had been stripped away in less than 5 minutes. That was quite a performance. The voice was deep, unfamiliar, touched with an accent she couldn't place. Nora looked up to find a man standing in the shadows between 2 oak trees, moonlight catching the silver threads in his black hair. He was tall, probably 6'4", with the kind of lean muscle that spoke of lethal grace rather than showy strength. His dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. Xander Blackmoon, Alpha of the Shadow Peak Pack, Crimson Veil's greatest rival, and definitely not someone she should be talking to while wearing a wedding dress and tear-streaked makeup. "I'm sorry," she managed, trying to stand. "I should go back inside." "I shouldn't be what? Breathing? Existing? Taking up space?" His voice held an edge of anger that confused her. "That display in there was designed to break you. Are you going to let it work?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't understand." Xander stepped closer, and she caught his scent. Pine and leather and something wild that made her wolf stir restlessly. "Your former fiancé just announced to 4 packs that you're worthless. Your alpha, the man who raised you, agreed. They humiliated you in front of everyone who matters in your world." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "What are you going to do about it?" Before she could answer, he moved with supernatural speed. One moment he was 3 feet away. The next his hand was on her neck, thumb pressing against her pulse point. She should have been terrified, should have screamed for help. Instead, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if some missing piece of herself had finally clicked into place. "You belong to me now," Xander said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate in her bones. Then his canines extended, and he bit down on the junction of her neck and shoulder, marking her as his mate in front of anyone who might be watching from the pack house windows. The claiming bite sent fire through her veins, a connection forming that was nothing like the tepid affection she'd expected with Blake. This was wild, consuming, dangerous, and completely outside her control. When he pulled back, his mark was already healing on her neck, a permanent brand that would tell every supernatural creature exactly who she belonged to now. "Welcome to Shadow Peak," Xander said, offering her his hand. Behind them, shouts erupted from the pack house as someone discovered what had just happened. In minutes, this garden would be full of angry Crimson Veil wolves demanding explanations she didn't have. Nora looked at the hand extended toward her, then back at the life she was leaving behind. There was no real choice to make. Blake and Carson had made that clear. She took Xander's hand and let him lead her into the darkness. The wedding dress she'd never get to wear properly trailing behind her like a ghost of the future she'd lost. In the distance, wolves began to howl. Chapter 3. Gilded Captivity. The Shadow Peak fortress rose from the mountainside like something carved from the bones of the earth itself. Black stone walls stretched toward the star-filled sky, broken by narrow windows that glowed with amber light. Ancient pine trees pressed close against the outer walls, their branches scraping against stone with sounds like whispered warnings. Nora pulled the fur-lined cloak Xander had given her tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the wedding dress that now felt like a mockery of everything she'd thought her life would be. The claiming mark on her neck throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder that her world had irrevocably changed in the span of an hour. "Impressive, isn't it?" Xander's voice held notes of pride as he guided her through the main gate. "My great-grandfather built the original structure 3 centuries ago. Every generation has added to it, strengthened it." Guards nodded respectfully as they passed, their faces carefully neutral as they took in the sight of their alpha, escorting a woman in a wedding dress through their territory. Nora caught fragments of whispered conversations. Crimson Veil, claiming, war. But Xander's presence kept anyone from staring too openly. The Great Hall was a study in controlled power. Massive fireplaces cast dancing shadows across walls lined with weapons and tapestries depicting Shadow Peak's violent history. Pack members moved with the fluid grace of predators, every interaction speaking to a hierarchy built on respect rather than fear. "Zoe," Xander called to a young woman arranging flowers near the main staircase. "Please prepare the blue guest suite for our visitor." The woman, barely 20, with the quick movements of an Omega, curtsied slightly. "Of course, Alpha. Should I inform Beta Garrett of the new arrival? I'll handle Garrett myself." Xander's tone suggested that conversation wouldn't be entirely pleasant. "Make sure our guest has everything she needs. Clothing, food, whatever she requires." As Zoe hurried away, Nora found her voice. "Guest? Is that what I am?" Xander studied her with those unsettling dark eyes. "What would you prefer to be called?" "Prisoner sounds harsh, considering you came willingly. Mate is premature, given the circumstances." He gestured toward the staircase. "Guest seems appropriate for now." The blue guest suite was beautiful in a way that made Nora's chest ache. Sapphire silk curtains framed windows that looked out over the mountains, and a fire crackled cheerfully in an ornate fireplace. The bed was large enough for 3 people, piled high with furs that looked incredibly soft. It was luxury beyond anything she'd known at Crimson Vale, and it felt like the most elegant prison cell in the world. Why? The question burst out of her before she could stop it. Why did you claim me? You don't know anything about me. Xander moved to the window, his profile sharp against the starlight. I know enough. I know Blake Carson is a fool who threw away something valuable because he lacks the vision to see what he had. I know your alpha raised you for 14 years only to publicly humiliate you when it served his political purposes. He turned to face her. And I know you're stronger than they gave you credit for, or you wouldn't have survived this long in that environment. You're wrong. The words came out bitter, hollow. I'm exactly what Blake said. An orphan with no bloodline, no power, no real value to anyone. Are you? Xander's voice held challenge. Then explain how you spotted the weakness in our perimeter defenses during your walk through the courtyard. Nora blinked, startled. I don't know what you mean. You were cataloging defensive positions from the moment we entered the gates. Your eyes tracked guard rotations, noted sight lines, identified potential escape routes. His smile held sharp approval. That's not the behavior of someone worthless, Nora. That's the instinct of a strategist. The observation sent chills down her spine because it was true. Even in her emotional turmoil, her mind had automatically assessed the fortress's layout, noted potential vulnerabilities. It was a habit she'd developed during childhood, when understanding pack dynamics had been crucial to survival. I just noticed things, she said weakly. Exactly. Xander moved closer, and she caught that wild scent again, pine and leather, and something dangerous that made her pulse quicken. Your former pack wasted your potential, because they were too focused on bloodlines and politics to see what they actually had. A mind like yours shouldn't be ornamental. Before she could respond, someone knocked sharply on the door. Xander opened it to reveal a man who radiated authority despite being shorter than his alpha. Silver streaked his dark hair, and scars crisscrossed his hands, the marks of a warrior who'd survived too many battles to count. Garrett, Xander said by way of introduction. My beta. Garrett, this is Nora. Garrett's green eyes swept over her wedding dress with obvious disapproval. The Crimson Vale delegation left 20 minutes ago. Carson was displeased. I imagine he was. Xander's tone suggested he found Carson's displeasure amusing rather than concerning. Any threats? The usual bluster about consequences and retaliation. Nothing we haven't heard before. Garrett's attention returned to Nora. Are you planning to explain why you've brought an enemy pack member into our territory? The word enemy hit like a slap. Nora stepped backward, suddenly aware of how precarious her position was. She was alone in hostile territory, wearing clothes that marked her as Carson's discarded property, protected only by the whim of an alpha she didn't understand. She's under my protection, Xander said simply. That makes her pack now, does it? Garrett's skepticism was clear. Or does it make her a liability? Carson raised her, trained her. How do we know this isn't some elaborate deception? Because, Xander said with patience that somehow sounded more dangerous than anger, Carson just publicly disowned her in front of 4 packs. Whatever use he might have had for her ended the moment Blake rejected their mating bond. The 2 men stared at each other in a silent battle of wills that Nora didn't fully understand. Finally, Garrett nodded curtly. I'll post guards. Discreet ones. His gaze flicked to Nora again. No offense intended, but trust must be earned here. After he left, silence stretched between them. Nora sank onto the edge of the massive bed, suddenly exhausted by the emotional whiplash of the evening. Everything she'd believed about her life had been stripped away in the space of hours, replaced by uncertainties that made her head spin. He's right to be suspicious, she said quietly. You don't know me. You don't know what I might do, what I might report back to Carson. Xander moved to the fireplace, resting one hand against the mantel. Firelight played across his features, highlighting the sharp cheekbones and the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. Do you want to go back to them? The question should have been easy to answer. Carson had given her a home when she'd had nothing. The Crimson Vale pack was all she'd ever known. But when she tried to picture walking back into that pack house, facing Blake's indifferent contempt and Carson's calculated manipulation, her stomach twisted with revulsion. "No," she whispered. "There's nothing for me there anymore. Then we understand each other." Xander straightened, his expression businesslike. "You'll stay here while we determine what comes next. You're free to move about the fortress, but don't leave the walls without an escort. The mountains can be dangerous for those who don't know them." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Nora, that dress is beautiful, but you might be more comfortable in something less formal. Zoe will bring you clothes in the morning." After he left, Nora stood alone in the elegant room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a pack that wasn't hers. Through the windows, she could see lights twinkling in the valley below, other territories stretching into the darkness. She touched the claiming mark on her neck, still tender from Xander's bite. The connection between them hummed beneath her skin, foreign and overwhelming. She didn't understand what he wanted from her, why he'd risked political consequences to claim a discarded bride from a rival pack. But for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen potential instead of obligation. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely beyond her control. Moving to the window, she pressed her palm against the cool glass and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Behind her, the wedding dress rustled with each breath, a reminder of the life she'd lost and the uncertain future she'd gained. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, their voices carrying messages she couldn't yet understand, but she was learning. Chapter 4. Proving Ground. 3 days had passed since Nora's arrival at Shadow Peak, and she was slowly learning the rhythm of her new life. The practical clothes Zoe had brought, dark jeans, wool sweaters, sturdy boots, felt strange after years of the feminine dresses Carson had preferred his daughter to wear, but they allowed her to move freely through the fortress, observing the intricate workings of a pack that operated on entirely different principles than Crimson Vale. Where Carson's pack functioned through fear and rigid hierarchy, Shadow Peak thrived on earned respect and genuine loyalty. Pack members challenged each other during training without worry of punishment. Conversations flowed freely across rank lines. Most surprising of all, Xander was accessible to anyone who needed his attention, not hidden behind layers of bureaucracy like Carson. "You're thinking too hard again," Garrett observed, finding her in the library where she'd spent most of her mornings. The beta had maintained professional distance since her arrival, but his outright hostility had mellowed into cautious acceptance. Nora looked up from the historical text she'd been reading, a chronicle of territorial disputes dating back 2 centuries. "Just trying to understand how things work here. And what have you concluded?" He settled into the chair across from her, genuinely curious. "Your alpha leads differently than mine did." She chose her words carefully, aware that criticism of Carson might sound like manipulation. "There's less performance, more substance." Garrett's weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. "Xander earned his position through merit, not birthright. Makes a difference in how he views leadership." Before Nora could respond, rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. A young warrior burst through the library doors, his face tight with urgency. "Beta Garrett, we have a problem. The Northern Patrol is 3 hours overdue, and we've lost radio contact." Nora's blood chilled. She'd learned enough about Shadow Peak's operations to know their patrols ran with military precision. 3 hours late meant something had gone seriously wrong. Garrett was on his feet instantly. "How many?" 4 wolves, including patrol leader Marcus Chen. They were checking the disputed border area near Raven's Gorge. "Rogues?" Garrett's voice had gone hard. "Tactical. Unknown. Alpha Xander is assembling a search team now." As the warrior hurried away, Nora found herself speaking without conscious thought. "Don't send them through the main pass." Both men turned to stare at her. Garrett's expression was carefully neutral, but she could sense his skepticism. "I'm sorry," she backtracked quickly. "I shouldn't have—" "No," Garrett interrupted. "Explain." Nora's mind raced, pulling together fragments of information from the historical texts, conversations she'd overheard, and her own observations of the territory. "If I were planning an ambush in that area, I'd position my forces to funnel rescue attempts through predictable routes." The main pass is obvious. It's where anyone would expect help to come from. And where would you send a rescue team? Garrett's tone had shifted from skeptical to interested. The Eastern Ridge. It's harder terrain, but it offers multiple escape routes if things go wrong. Plus, if the patrol is injured and hiding, they'd likely move toward higher ground for better visibility. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Come with me. The war room buzzed with controlled urgency. Maps covered every surface, marked with colored pins denoting patrol routes, territorial boundaries, and potential threats. Xander stood at the center of it all, his dark hair pulled back as he coordinated search efforts with the focused intensity of a predator tracking prey. Alpha, Garrett called. Nora has a tactical suggestion. Every conversation in the room stopped. A dozen pairs of eyes turned toward her, measuring, evaluating. Nora's instinct was to shrink back, to apologize for presuming to offer input. Instead, she forced herself to step forward. Show me, Xander said simply. Nora moved to the large topographical map dominating the center table. Her finger traced the route the missing patrol would have taken. They were checking this sector, near the disputed boundary. If someone wanted to ambush a Shadow Peak patrol, this area offers good cover and multiple escape routes. She indicated a narrow canyon that cut through the mountains. But if they were planning something larger, maybe hoping to draw in a rescue team, they'd want to control the battlefield. Xander leaned closer, his attention completely focused on her analysis. Go on. The main pass is the obvious rescue route. It's fast, direct, but it's also a bottleneck. Easy to monitor, easier to trap. Her finger moved to trace an alternative path. The Eastern Ridge is harder terrain, but it gives you options. If the patrol managed to escape the initial ambush, that's where they'd go. That route would take twice as long. One of the warriors objected. Yes, Nora agreed, but it would get your people there alive. Silence settled over the room as Xander studied the map. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes held something she couldn't quite identify. Marcus is smart, he said slowly. If he was ambushed and managed to get away, he'd think tactically. High ground, multiple exits, positions that favor defense over attack. He looked at Nora directly. You think like he does. It wasn't quite a compliment, but it felt like recognition. For the first time since her arrival, she'd contributed something valuable, instead of simply existing as Xander's mysterious acquisition. Take the Eastern Ridge, Xander decided. Full team, but spread formation. If this is an ambush, don't give them a concentrated target. As the warriors hurried to prepare, Nora expected to be dismissed. Instead, Xander turned to her. I want you with the communications team. Your tactical insight might be useful if we encounter complications. Alpha, Garrett interjected carefully. Is that wise? She's untested in field conditions. She'll be safely positioned with our tech team, well away from any fighting. Xander's tone brooked no argument, but her perspective has already proven valuable. An hour later, Nora found herself crouched behind a rocky outcropping halfway up the Eastern Ridge. A radio headset connecting her to teams spread across the mountainside. The communications specialist, a quiet beta named Riley, had explained the basics of field coordination, but mostly she was there to observe and advise if needed. Team 3 to base, crackled through the radio. We have visual on the patrol. 4 wolves, all alive but injured. They're holed up in a cave system about 2 clicks from your position. Relief flooded through Nora. They were alive. Any sign of hostiles? Xander's voice came through clearly. Negative. Looks like they fought off the initial attack and managed to retreat. Marcus is conscious and giving us tactical details now. As the rescue unfolded smoothly, exactly as Nora's analysis had predicted, she felt something shift inside her chest. For years at Crimson Vale, she'd been ornamental. Pretty, polite, useful for sealing political alliances, but not much else. Here, her thoughts mattered. Her insights had potentially saved lives. Good work, Riley said quietly as they packed up the communications equipment. Your route suggestion was solid. The words were simple, professional, but they hit Nora with surprising force. When was the last time anyone at Crimson Vale had acknowledged her contributions? When had Blake or Carson ever asked for her opinion on anything more significant than flower arrangements? By the time they returned to the fortress, word had spread about the successful rescue. Pack members nodded respectfully as she passed, no longer seeing her as simply their alpha's mysterious guest. She'd proven herself useful, and in a pack that valued competence above bloodline, that mattered. Nora. Xander appeared at her elbow as she headed toward the main staircase. Walk with me. They moved through the fortress in comfortable silence, eventually emerging onto a balcony that overlooked the valley. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and the beauty of it made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. You saved 4 lives today, Xander said finally. I just looked at a map and made suggestions. Your people did the real work. Leadership isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about making the right decisions with the information available. He turned to study her profile. You have good instincts. The praise warmed her more than it should have. Carson never thought so. Carson is a politician who sees only political uses for the people around him. He looked at you and saw a marriage alliance, a way to secure loyalty through obligation. Xander's voice held quiet anger. He never bothered to discover what you were actually capable of. The words stirred something deep in her chest. A hunger she'd buried so completely she'd forgotten it existed. The desire to be valued for her mind, her contributions, her potential. Not just her willingness to be shaped into whatever role someone else needed her to fill. What do you see when you look at me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Xander's dark eyes held hers steadily. I see someone who's been underestimated her entire life. Someone with sharp instincts and tactical intelligence that could be extraordinary with proper development. He paused. And I see someone who's never been given the chance to discover what she's truly capable of. The claiming mark on her neck pulsed with warmth, reminding her of the connection that bound them together. It was still foreign, still overwhelming, but it no longer felt like a cage. Instead, it felt like possibility. What happens now? She asked. Now you decide what you want your life to look like, Xander replied. You're not Carson's political pawn anymore. You're not Blake's discarded bride. You're free to become whoever you choose to be. As the last light faded from the mountains, Nora considered the prospect of freedom. Real freedom, not the illusion of choice she'd lived with at Crimson Vale. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. For the first time in her life, the future felt like something she might actually help create. Chapter 5. Buried Truths. 2 weeks had passed since the successful rescue mission, and Nora had settled into an unexpected rhythm at Shadow Peak. Her mornings were spent in the archives, poring over territorial histories and treaty documents that stretched back centuries. Her afternoons involved tactical discussions with Garrett and the other senior pack members, her insights increasingly valued and sought after. It was during one of these research sessions that she found the file that would change everything. The leather portfolio was wedged behind a row of ceremonial texts, as if someone had hidden it deliberately. The label, written in fading ink, simply read, Whitfield Investigation, Classified. Nora's breath caught. She hadn't seen her family name written anywhere in over 14 years. With trembling fingers, she opened the portfolio. The first document was an incident report dated 15 years ago, detailing the rogue attack that had killed her parents. But as she read further, discrepancies began to emerge. The attack patterns described didn't match typical rogue behavior. The timeline of events had gaps that didn't make sense. Most damning of all, there were witness statements that had been sealed by order of Alpha Carson himself. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, had been investigating unusual pack member deaths in the months before his murder. Pack members who had all opposed Carson's increasingly authoritarian leadership style. The final document in the file was a half-finished report in her father's handwriting, detailing his suspicions about corruption within the pack's inner circle. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Her parents hadn't died in a random attack. They'd been murdered to silence her father's investigation. Nora? Xander's voice came from the archive doorway. Riley said you'd been here for hours without... He stopped, taking in her pale face and shaking hands. What did you find? She couldn't speak, couldn't form words around the crushing weight in her chest. Instead, she handed him the portfolio and watched his expression darken as he read. Son of a bitch, he breathed. Carson had your parents killed. Not just Carson. Nora's voice came out hoarse, broken. She pointed to a signature on one of the witness statements. Vera. My Aunt Vera was involved. She helped plan it. The betrayal cut deeper than Blake's rejection, deeper than Carson's manipulation. Vera had held her while she cried for her murdered parents, had raised her with what she'd believed was love, had been the only family she'd thought she had left, all while knowing she'd helped orchestrate their deaths. Xander moved to her side, his presence solid and grounding. How long have you been carrying suspicions about this? I never suspected anything, Nora admitted. I was 8 years old when it happened. Carson and Vera told me rogues killed them, and I believed it. Why wouldn't I? They took me in, gave me a home. Her laugh came out bitter, hollow. God. I spent 14 years grateful to the people who murdered my family. They counted on that gratitude, Xander said quietly. Children who feel indebted are easier to control, easier to manipulate into whatever role you need them to fill. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Carson had eliminated her father to protect his corrupt dealings, then taken her in to maintain the illusion of benevolence. The arranged marriage to Blake hadn't been about securing alliances. It had been about permanently binding the last Whitfield to the Carson family, ensuring her silence forever. There's more, Xander said grimly, still reading through the documents. Your father wasn't just investigating pack member deaths. He'd discovered evidence of Carson selling information to rival packs, including details about our patrol routes and defensive positions. Nora's blood turned to ice. That's treason. High treason. The kind that starts wars and gets innocent wolves killed. Xander's jaw was tight with controlled fury. Some of these intelligence leaks happened just before major conflicts. Good wolves died because of Carson's betrayals. The room spun around her as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Her father had died trying to expose Carson's crimes. Her mother had died simply for being married to an honest wolf. And she'd spent her entire life believing her guardians were heroes instead of murderers. I have to go back, she said suddenly, lurching to her feet. I have to confront them, make them pay for what they did. No, Xander's voice was firm. That's exactly what they'd expect. You show up at Crimson Vale making accusations, they'll claim you're a bitter ex-pack member spreading lies. Worse, they might decide you're too dangerous to leave alive. So what? I do nothing? Let them get away with murder? You do nothing reckless, Xander corrected. This evidence is 15 years old. We need to build a case that will hold up before the Territorial Council, something that will bring real justice instead of just revenge. Before Nora could respond, urgent knocking echoed through the archives. Garrett appeared in the doorway, his face grim with the kind of expression that preceded bad news. Alpha, we have a problem. Vera Whitfield is here under a peace banner, requesting immediate audience. She claims to be negotiating for Nora's safe return to Crimson Vale. The portfolio slipped from Nora's numb fingers, documents scattering across the floor. After 14 years of lies, Vera had come to collect her wayward niece. The timing felt too convenient, too calculated. She knows, Nora whispered. Somehow she knows we found the evidence. Xander was already moving, gathering the scattered documents with efficient precision. Garrett, how long until the meeting? 20 minutes. She's waiting in the formal reception hall with 2 guards. Perfect. Xander's smile held no warmth whatsoever. That gives us time to prepare a proper welcome. Alpha, Garrett said carefully, if this is about territorial violations or pack politics, we need to handle it diplomatically. We can't afford to provoke Carson into open warfare over one pack member. This isn't about pack politics, Xander replied, his voice deadly quiet. It's about murder, and I have no intention of being diplomatic with child killers. Nora felt the world tilt around her. In 20 minutes, she would face the woman who had helped murder her parents, who had spent 14 years lying to her face, who had come here to drag her back to Crimson Vale for reasons that couldn't possibly be good. The claiming mark on her neck pulsed with heat, and through their bond she felt Xander's rage on her behalf. Protective, fierce, and completely unwavering. For the first time since finding the portfolio, she didn't feel alone with the weight of this revelation. What do you need me to do? She asked. I need you to be smart, Xander said. Let her talk first. Let her reveal why she's really here. Don't give away what we know until we understand her game. And if she tries to take me by force? Xander's eyes went completely black, his wolf rising close to the surface. She won't. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but Nora found herself thinking about the wider implications of this confrontation. If Vera suspected they had evidence of Carson's crimes, she wouldn't have come alone or unprepared. This meeting could be the opening move in something much larger and more dangerous. Garrett, Xander continued, I want additional security in the hall, but keep them discreet. If this goes bad, I don't want Vera thinking we were planning trouble. Already handled, Garrett replied. But Alpha, are you sure about bringing Nora to this meeting? If Vera realizes we know about the murders, then we deal with the consequences, Xander said simply. Nora deserves to face the woman who destroyed her family, and Vera deserves to explain herself. As they prepared to leave the archives, Nora caught sight of her reflection in a darkened window. The frightened, grateful girl who had arrived at Shadow Peak 3 weeks ago was gone. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, tempered by betrayal and strengthened by truth. She'd spent her entire life being shaped by other people's lies and agendas. But Carson and Vera had made one crucial mistake. They'd taught her to survive in a world of deception and manipulation. Now she was going to use those skills against them. The claiming mark pulsed again, and she felt Xander's steady presence through their bond. Whatever game Vera was playing, whatever trap she'd walked into by coming here, Nora wouldn't face it alone. For the first time in her life, she had someone who valued her enough to fight for her, and she was about to discover exactly how dangerous that made her. Let's go, she said, squaring her shoulders. It's time for some honest conversation. Xander's smile was sharp as a blade. I was hoping you'd say that. The portfolio tucked safely under his arm. They headed toward a confrontation that would determine not just Nora's future, but the fate of both their packs. In the reception hall, Vera waited with the patience of a predator who believed she'd already won. She was about to learn otherwise. Chapter 6. Unmasked. The formal reception hall at Shadow Peak had been designed to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings stretched toward shadow, and ancestral portraits lined the walls. Generations of Black Moon alphas whose painted eyes seemed to judge anyone who dared enter their domain. Massive windows overlooked the valley below, but heavy curtains had been drawn, leaving only firelight to illuminate the room. Vera Whitfield sat in the center of it all like a spider in an elegant web. She wore a charcoal gray suit that emphasized her authority as Beta, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in that severe style that had intimidated Nora throughout her childhood. 2 Crimson Veil guards flanked her chair, their postures alert but respectful of the peace banner that protected this meeting. When Nora entered beside Xander, Vera's pale eyes widened with what might have been genuine relief. Nora, sweetheart. Vera rose smoothly, arms extended as if for an embrace. Thank the moon goddess you're safe. When we heard about the claiming, about what that monster did to you, she shot Xander a look of calculated hatred. We've been so worried. The endearment hit Nora like a physical blow. How many times had Vera called her sweetheart while knowing she'd helped murder her parents? How many false embraces had she endured from the woman who'd orchestrated her family's destruction? Aunt Vera? Nora managed, her voice carefully neutral. This is unexpected. I can imagine. Vera's gaze swept over Nora's practical clothes, the way she stood close to Xander's side, the claiming mark visible on her neck. Alpha Carson sent me to negotiate your return home. We know this claiming was forced, done without your consent. No one will hold you responsible for what happened under duress. Xander spoke for the first time, his voice deceptively mild. Interesting assumption, Beta Whitfield. What makes you think the claiming was forced? Vera's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Please, Alpha Black Moon. Nora was raised as Carson's daughter. She's gentle, sheltered, completely unprepared for the harsh realities of mountain pack life. Obviously, you took advantage of her vulnerable state after that unfortunate scene at the wedding. Unfortunate scene? Nora's voice sharpened despite her efforts to stay calm. Is that what you're calling it? Blake's public humiliation of me in front of 4 packs? Blake made a mistake, Vera said smoothly. Young wolves often act impulsively. Carson has spoken with him extensively, and he's prepared to honor the original mating agreement. You can still be Luna of Crimson Veil. Still have the life you were raised for. The audacity of it stole Nora's breath. They expected her to crawl back, to pretend the rejection had never happened, to mate with a man who'd called her worthless in front of hundreds of witnesses. More than that, they expected her to be grateful for the opportunity. How generous of Blake to reconsider, Xander said, his tone sharp with sarcasm. And what does Carson offer in return for this magnificent second chance? Full pardoning of your territorial violations, Vera replied immediately. The claiming of a Crimson Veil Pack member without permission was an act of war. But Carson is prepared to overlook it in the interest of peace. All we want is Nora's safe return. And if she chooses to stay, Vera's mask slipped slightly, revealing the steel beneath. She won't. Nora is loyal to her family, to the pack that raised her. She understands duty and obligation. Don't you, sweetheart? The question was loaded with years of conditioning, with the weight of guilt and manufactured gratitude that had shaped Nora's entire life. The old Nora would have nodded, would have apologized for causing trouble, would have packed her things and followed Vera home like a dutiful daughter. But the old Nora hadn't known the truth about her parents' deaths. I do understand duty, Nora said quietly. I understand it very well. Which is why I need to ask you something, Aunt Vera. Vera's expression grew cautious. Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Nora moved to stand directly in front of her aunt, close enough to see the fine lines around those pale eyes, close enough to smell the familiar perfume that had once meant safety and comfort. Now it made her stomach turn. Why did you help Carson murder my parents? The silence that followed was deafening. Vera went completely still, her face cycling through surprise, denial, and finally settling on cold calculation. The guards behind her shifted nervously, hands moving toward weapons before catching themselves. I don't know what you're talking about, Vera said finally, but her voice had lost its warm, maternal tone. Your parents died in a rogue attack 15 years ago. You know that. Do I? Nora pulled the investigation portfolio from where Xander had tucked it inside his jacket. Because according to my father's files, the only rogue in that forest was you. Vera's eyes fixed on the portfolio like a snake watching a mongoose. Where did you get that? From the Shadow Peak archives, where your friend Carson stored it after he had my father killed. Nora opened the folder, pulling out the witness statement with Vera's signature. Funny thing about evidence. It has a way of surviving even when the people it implicates think it's been buried forever. That's fabricated, Vera stammered, but the color had drained from her face. Carson would never sell intelligence to rival packs? Never order the death of his own beta to cover up treason? Never adopt the victim's daughter to maintain his image as a benevolent leader? Nora's voice grew stronger with each word. Because according to these files, he did all of that and more. The guards were looking between Nora and Vera with growing confusion, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Behind her, Nora felt Xander's presence like a shield, his silence allowing her to confront her demons in her own way. Vera stood abruptly, her composure cracking. Even if those allegations were true, and I'm not saying they are, what would you gain by pursuing them? Your parents are dead. Nothing will bring them back. You have a chance at a real life with Blake, at becoming Luna of a powerful pack. Why would you throw that away for revenge? This isn't about revenge, Nora said. It's about justice, about making sure no other children grow up believing their parents' killers are heroes. You ungrateful little... Vera caught herself, glancing at the guards who were watching this exchange with obvious shock. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled but venomous. I raised you. I fed you, clothed you, loved you like my own daughter. And this is how you repay me? With wild accusations and conspiracy theories? You raised me to be compliant, Nora corrected. To never ask questions, never challenge authority, never demand more than what I was given. You raised me to be the perfect victim. Vera's laugh was sharp, bitter. And what are you now? The mate of a mountain savage who claimed you like a piece of property? You think that's better than being Luna of Crimson Veil? Yes, Nora said without hesitation. Because he sees me as a partner, not a pawn. Because he values my mind, not just my usefulness. Because when I proved I could contribute something meaningful, he didn't try to diminish it or control it. She stepped closer, and Vera actually took a step back. Most importantly, Because he's never lied to me about who killed my family. The mask was completely gone now. The woman standing before Nora bore no resemblance to the loving aunt who had comforted her through nightmares, who had taught her to braid her hair, who had been the only mother figure she'd ever known. This was a stranger wearing Vera's face, cold and calculating and utterly without remorse. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Vera hissed. "Carson has connections you can't imagine, power that reaches far beyond Crimson Vale. If you pursue this vendetta, you won't just destroy yourself. You'll destroy everyone in this pathetic mountain pack." "Is that a threat, Beta Whitfield?" Xander's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "It's a reality," Vera snapped, turning her venom on him. "You think claiming one discarded bride makes you powerful? Carson has been planning for this conversation since the day you stole her. Every move you've made, every decision you've taken, he's been 3 steps ahead." Before anyone could respond, one of the guards cleared his throat nervously. "Beta Whitfield? Should we prepare to return to Crimson Vale?" Vera looked at him with something approaching pity. "Oh, Marcus, you still think this was a rescue mission?" The guard's hand went to his weapon as understanding dawned in his eyes. "Beta? Carson's orders were very specific," Vera continued, her attention returning to Nora. "Bring her home if possible. If not," she shrugged eloquently. The second guard was already moving, silver blade flashing in the firelight as he lunged toward Nora. But Xander was faster, intercepting the attack with inhuman speed, his own claws extending as he drove the assassin backward. Chaos erupted in the reception hall. The first guard, Marcus, drew his weapon but seemed frozen by shock at Vera's betrayal. Shadow Peak warriors who had been stationed discreetly around the room moved to neutralize threats, but the close quarters made clean action difficult. Through it all, Vera stood calmly in the center of the violence, watching Nora with those cold, pale eyes. 14 years I spent molding you into the perfect weapon," she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather while wolves fought for their lives around them. "Quiet, obedient, grateful. Do you know how disappointed Carson was when Blake rejected you? All that careful conditioning, wasted." Nora felt something shift deep inside her chest. The frightened girl who had always sought approval, who had swallowed every lie and smiled through every manipulation, finally died. In her place stood a woman who had seen the face of evil, wearing the mask of love, and refused to be its victim any longer. "You're wrong," Nora said, her voice cutting through the sounds of combat. "You didn't create a weapon. You created someone who survived in spite of you. And now I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of monsters you and Carson really are." Vera's smile was sharp as broken glass. "We'll see about that, sweetheart." The endearment, twisted with poison, was the last thing she said before Xander's claws found her throat. Justice, Nora realized, sometimes wore the face of a claiming mate who refused to let anyone hurt what belonged to him. The silence that followed was final and absolute. Chapter 7. Reckoning. The aftermath of Vera's death left the reception hall eerily quiet. Shadow Peak warriors moved with practiced efficiency, securing the scene while medics tended to minor injuries from the brief but violent confrontation. The surviving Crimson Vale guard, Marcus, sat in restraints with the shell-shocked expression of a man whose entire worldview had crumbled in the space of minutes. Nora stood over her aunt's body, feeling strangely hollow. She'd expected rage, grief, some cathartic release of emotion. Instead, there was only a cold sense of completion, as if a chapter of her life had finally closed. "Are you all right?" Xander appeared at her side, his clothes torn, but otherwise unharmed. The protective fury that had driven him to kill Vera was banked now, replaced by concern for his mate. "I think so," Nora said honestly. "Is that wrong? Shouldn't I feel something more?" "You feel what you need to feel," he replied simply. "Vera stopped being your family the moment she helped murder your parents. What happened here was justice, not murder." Garrett approached with a grim expression and a communication device in his hand. "Alpha, we've been monitoring Crimson Vale radio frequencies. Carson has mobilized his entire pack. They're moving toward our borders. How long do we have? 6 hours, maybe less. He's not waiting for Vera's return. This was always meant to be the opening move in something larger." Nora felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. It was never about bringing me home. Vera's mission was to confirm we had the evidence, then eliminate any witnesses who could testify against Carson. A false flag operation, Xander agreed. Attack our territory under the pretense of rescuing you. Kill everyone who knew the truth about his crimes, then claim we murdered his peace delegation. Except now, he doesn't have a peace delegation to point to, Garrett observed. Just a dead beta and a guard who can testify to her attempting assassination. Before anyone could respond, Marcus lifted his head with obvious effort. You don't understand, he said, his voice hoarse. Carson doesn't need proof for what he's planning. He's not just bringing Crimson Veil, he's assembled a coalition. 3 packs, maybe 4. They think you're building an army to threaten territorial stability. The implications hit Nora like a physical blow. That's why he needed me eliminated. Not just to hide his crimes, but to prevent anyone from exposing the lies he's been spreading about Shadow Peak. What lies? Xander's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to his former pack and horror at what he'd discovered. Finally, he spoke. He's been telling other alphas that you're planning territorial expansion, that the claiming of Nora was the first step in destabilizing the region. He has forged evidence, communications that appear to be from you, discussing invasion plans. Son of a bitch, Garrett breathed. He's not just covering up murder. He's trying to start a war that will eliminate Shadow Peak entirely. The war room had been transformed into a command center that hummed with controlled urgency. Maps covered every surface, marked with troop movements and defensive positions. Senior pack members coordinated preparations with the kind of efficiency that spoke to years of training for exactly this scenario. But as Nora studied the tactical situation, her blood chilled. Even with their superior defensive position and intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain, they were vastly outnumbered. 400 wolves, she said aloud, her voice cutting through the strategic discussions. Carson's brought 400 wolves against our 150. Our 163, Xander corrected. But you're right. The numbers aren't in our favor. Numbers aren't everything, Garrett added, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. We know this territory. We have better equipment, better training. And Carson has the benefit of righteous fury, Nora countered. His wolves believe they're avenging a murdered peace delegation. They'll fight harder because they think they're the heroes. The room fell silent as the weight of their situation settled over everyone present. They were facing annihilation based on lies and forged evidence, and the truth would die with them if they failed to survive the next 24 hours. There has to be another way, Nora said suddenly. Some option that doesn't involve a massacre. Such as? Xander's tone was patient, but she could feel his skepticism through their bond. We expose Carson before the fighting starts. Show the coalition packs what he really is. Turn them against him instead of us. How? They're 6 hours away, hyped up on Carson's propaganda, and convinced we're the villains in this scenario. Nora moved to the large communication console that dominated one corner of the war room. What if we could broadcast the truth directly to them? Override their communications, force them to hear Marcus testify about what really happened. That's... Garrett paused, considering the possibilities. Actually, not impossible. We have the equipment to override military frequencies, but Carson's people would shut us down within minutes. Minutes might be enough, Nora said, her mind racing through possibilities. Not to tell the whole story, but to plant enough doubt to fracture the coalition. Xander studied her with those intense dark eyes. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Carson spent 15 years building his reputation on lies. What happens when some of those lies get exposed in front of the wolves who trust him most? The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Technical teams worked to configure broadcasting equipment, while Nora and Marcus prepared testimony that would be devastating in its brevity and impact. Every minute counted. Too long, and Carson's forces would shut down the transmission. Too short, and they wouldn't convey enough truth to matter. As the enemy coalition approached Shadow Peak's borders, Nora stood before the communications array with Marcus beside her. Through the windows, she could see their own warriors taking defensive positions, preparing for a battle that might never come if her gamble succeeded. You ready for this? she asked Marcus, who still looked shaken by the revelations about his former pack's leadership. "I've served under Carson for 8 years," he said quietly. "I need to make sure good wolves don't die for his lies." The communication officer nodded to Nora. "We're patched into their command frequencies. You'll be broadcasting directly to every wolf in that coalition force." Nora took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her pack's survival resting on the next few minutes. "This is Nora Whitfield, speaking from Shadow Peak territory to the coalition forces approaching our borders." Static crackled across the line, but she could hear shouting in the background as Carson's people tried to shut down the transmission. "You've been told that Alpha Black Moon claimed me by force, that Shadow Peak is planning territorial expansion, that your invasion is necessary for regional stability. All of these are lies, perpetrated by Alpha Carson to hide his own crimes. 15 years ago, Carson ordered the murder of my parents to prevent exposure of his treasonous activities. My father, Thomas Whitfield, discovered evidence that Carson was selling pack intelligence to rival territories. When he tried to bring this information to light, Carson had him killed and staged the scene to look like a rogue attack. More shouting from the coalition frequencies, but the transmission was holding. The woman you know as Beta Vera Whitfield helped plan my parents' deaths, then spent 14 years raising me as Carson's grateful ward. Tonight, she came to Shadow Peak under a peace banner with orders to assassinate anyone who could testify to Carson's crimes." Marcus stepped forward, his voice clear and strong. "I am Marcus Chen, Crimson Veil Pack Guard. I witnessed Beta Whitfield attempt assassination under direct orders from Alpha Carson. Everything Nora Whitfield has said is true. We came here to commit murder, not rescue a kidnapped pack member." The transmission cut out abruptly, but not before they heard chaos erupting across multiple frequencies. Arguments, demands for explanations, the sound of a coalition fracturing under the weight of unexpected truth. "Now we wait," Xander said, moving to Nora's side. They didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, scouts reported that 2 of the 4 coalition packs had withdrawn from the advance, their alphas demanding answers from Carson that he couldn't provide. The remaining force was still formidable, but no longer overwhelming. More importantly, Carson's credibility was in ruins. The other territorial leaders who had trusted his word were now questioning everything he'd told them, creating political problems that would outlast any military confrontation. "It's working," Garrett reported as updates continued to flow in. "The Moonridge Pack has officially withdrawn support. Their alpha is calling for a territorial council investigation into Carson's activities." By dawn, Carson's Grand Coalition had been reduced to his own pack and a handful of loyalists who either didn't believe the revelations or didn't care. The invasion that should have overwhelmed Shadow Peak had become a politically disastrous rout that left Carson exposed and friendless. "He'll still fight," Nora said, as they watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "He has nothing left to lose now. Let him come," Xander replied. "The truth is out. Whatever happens next, history will remember who the real monster was." Standing on the fortress walls beside the mate who had given her the strength to face her demons, Nora felt something she'd never experienced before. Complete certainty in her own worth. She was no longer Carson's grateful ward or Blake's rejected bride. She was a strategist, a survivor, and a woman who had looked evil in the face and refused to blink. Whatever came next, she would meet it as herself. Finally, fully, and without apology. The claiming mark on her neck pulsed with warmth, and through their bond she felt Xander's fierce pride in what she'd accomplished. Together, they watched the sun rise on their new world. Chapter 8. New Foundations. 6 months had passed since the Coalition's collapse, and the Territorial Council's investigation had been thorough and devastating. Carson faced charges of treason, murder, and conspiracy that would likely result in permanent exile or execution. Blake had been stripped of his inheritance, left to face the consequences of his father's crimes with nothing but his own inadequate character to sustain him. The Crimson Veil Pack, under new leadership, had formally apologized to Shadow Peak and offered reparations that Xander had graciously accepted. More importantly, they had provided additional testimony that filled in the remaining gaps in the case against Carson. Nora stood in what had once been the archives where she'd discovered the truth about her parents' murders. Now it served as her official office, complete with communication equipment that connected her to territorial councils across the region. Her role as Shadow Peak's diplomatic liaison had evolved naturally from her analytical skills and her unique understanding of interpack politics. The Riverside Pack wants to renegotiate their border agreements, she told Xander, as he entered with 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual they'd developed over the winter months. Apparently, Carson had been feeding them false information about our territorial claims for years. More cleanup from his legacy of lies, Xander observed, settling into the chair across from her desk. How many does that make? 14 separate diplomatic issues that can be traced back to Carson's manipulations. It's remarkable how much damage one corrupt alpha can do over 15 years. Nora accepted her coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Though I have to admit, I'm enjoying the work of rebuilding these relationships. You're good at it, Xander said. And the simple statement carried weight beyond its words. The other territorial leaders respect you. Trust your judgment. That's not something that can be manufactured or inherited. It has to be earned. The claiming mark on her neck had long since healed into a permanent reminder of how dramatically her life had changed. But more than that, it had become a symbol of partnership rather than possession. She and Xander worked together as equals, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that made both of them more effective leaders. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Riley, the communications specialist, entered with a tablet displaying message logs. "Luna, you have several priority communications. The Territorial Council wants your input on new intelligence sharing protocols, and there's a request from the Moonridge Pack for mediation assistance with a boundary dispute." Luna. The title still sent a thrill through her, not because of its prestige, but because she'd earned it through her actions rather than marriage or birthright. The pack members who called her Luna did so with genuine respect, having seen her prove herself during the crisis with Carson. "Schedule the Territorial Council meeting for next week," Nora decided. "And tell Moonridge I'll review their dispute materials and get back to them within 48 hours. After Riley left, Xander moved around the desk to stand behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. "You realize you're working too hard again?" says the Alpha who was up until midnight reviewing security protocols. Nora countered, leaning back against his chest. The comfortable intimacy of the gesture spoke to how their relationship had deepened, beyond the claiming bond into genuine partnership and love. "Fair point," he conceded, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Though I have something that might convince you to take a break." "Oh? What's that?" Instead of answering, he moved to the window overlooking the courtyard. "Look." Nora joined him at the window and gasped. Below, pack members had gathered in celebration around a young couple who stood beside the fountain. The same fountain where she'd first encountered Xander on the worst night of her life. The bride wore a simple but elegant dress of pale blue silk, while her mate stood beside her with obvious adoration. "Sarah Martinez and David Chen," Xander explained. "Marcus's younger brother and one of our engineering specialists. They wanted to have their mating ceremony here, at Shadow Peak, because they said our pack represents the possibility of building something new from the ruins of the past." The words hit Nora unexpectedly hard. She watched the young couple exchange vows of their own choosing, surrounded by pack members who celebrated their love without reservation or political calculation. It was everything her own wedding to Blake should have been, and wasn't. "Are you all right?" Xander's voice held concern. "More than all right," Nora said softly. "I was just thinking about how different my life might have been if I'd never found the courage to question what I was told, to demand more than what I was offered." "You always had that courage," Xander said firmly. "Carson and Vera just spent years convincing you to suppress it. But it was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Below them, the ceremony concluded with cheers and applause. Sarah and David were surrounded by well-wishers, their faces bright with the kind of joy that came from choosing each other freely. "I want that," Nora said suddenly. Xander went very still behind her. "Want what?" "A real ceremony. Not the political theater Carson planned. Not the claiming that happened in crisis. A celebration of what we've built together, what we choose to be to each other." When she turned to face him, his dark eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you asking me to marry you, Luna Nora Blackmoon?" The name sent warmth flooding through her chest. She'd been thinking of herself as Nora Blackmoon for months, but hearing it spoken aloud by the man she loved made it feel official in a way that legal documents couldn't match. "I'm asking if you want to celebrate what we already are," she corrected. "Partners, mates, equals who chose each other and built something stronger together than either of us could manage alone." His answer came in the form of a kiss that was tender and fierce in equal measure, a claiming that was entirely mutual this time. 2 years later, Nora stood once again on the balcony overlooking the valley. But everything about the scene had changed. The fortress below bustled with activity as pack members prepared for the evening meal. Children played in the courtyard gardens, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted up through the mountain air. Her hand rested on her rounded belly, feeling the strong kicks of the pup who would be born in another month. Their child would grow up knowing both sides of their heritage, Xander's mountain strength and her strategic mind, the Black Moon legacy, and the Whitfield honor that had been restored through truth and justice. "Still working too hard," Xander observed, joining her on the balcony with the evening reports she'd requested. "Says the alpha who's been in meetings since dawn," Nora replied, but she accepted the documents gratefully. Even heavily pregnant, she found it difficult to step away from the diplomatic work that had become her passion. "The Territorial Council officially approved your proposal for the Interpack Intelligence Sharing Network," he told her. 5 packs have already signed on, with 3 more considering it. "Good." Carson's ability to operate in secrecy was what made his crimes possible. Transparency and accountability will prevent another situation like that. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their pack settle into evening routines. It was a peaceful scene, but Nora's mind was already working on the challenges they'd face tomorrow. Trade negotiations, boundary disputes, and the constant work of maintaining the delicate balance between pack autonomy and regional cooperation. "Do you ever wonder what your parents would think of all this?" Xander asked quietly. Nora considered the question seriously. Thomas and Marie Whitfield had died trying to expose corruption and protect their pack from a leader who valued power over justice. Their daughter now worked to ensure such corruption couldn't flourish in darkness again. "I think they'd be proud," she said finally. "Not because of the titles or the recognition, but because I finally learned to use my voice instead of hiding from it." A strong kick from the pup made her wince, and Xander's hand immediately covered hers on her belly. Through their bond, she felt his wonder and protectiveness, his excitement about meeting the child who would carry both their legacies forward. "What do you think our daughter will be like?" he asked. "Stubborn, brilliant, and completely unwilling to accept anyone else's definition of what she should be," Nora replied without hesitation. "In other words, she'll be perfect." "Daughter." The healer said it was too early to tell. "Call it Luna's intuition." Nora leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of the man who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. "She's going to be a force to be reckoned with." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Nora reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started as Carson's grateful ward, convinced that her highest aspiration was to become Blake's convenient mate. Rejection and betrayal had shattered that limited world, but from the ruins, she'd built something infinitely better. She was Luna of Shadow Peak, diplomatic liaison to the Territorial Council, and mate to an alpha who valued her mind as much as her heart. Most importantly, she was herself, fully, authentically, and without apology. The claiming mark on her neck pulsed with warmth as Xander's arms tightened around her. Through their bond, she felt his absolute certainty in their shared future, his pride in what they'd accomplished together, and his fierce love for the woman she'd become. In the distance, wolves howled their evening songs, not calls of loneliness or loss, but celebrations of pack bonds and territorial security. It was the sound of a community that had weathered crisis and emerged stronger, united by truth instead of divided by lies. Nora added her own voice to the chorus, a Luna's call that carried across the mountains and beyond. It spoke of justice achieved, love chosen freely, and a future built on the unshakable foundation of knowing exactly who she was and what she was worth. The answering calls came from across the territory, pack members acknowledging their Luna, celebrating the life they'd built together, and welcoming the next generation that would carry their legacy forward. As the last echoes faded into the mountain night, Nora smiled and prepared for tomorrow's challenges, secure in the knowledge that she would face them as herself, beside the mate who had always seen her true potential. The girl who had once begged for scraps of acceptance was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who commanded respect, created change, and never again would settle for less than she deserved. Nora's story of rising from abandoned bride to powerful Luna proves that our greatest betrayals can become our strongest foundations. But her tale is just one thread in a vast tapestry of supernatural romance. Every day we bring you stories of characters who refuse to settle for less than they deserve. Wolves who discover their true strength, mates who choose love over convenience, and hearts that heal through unexpected connections. What did you think of Nora's transformation? Drop a comment and let us know which moment hit you hardest. Was it her confrontation with Vera, her first tactical victory? Or perhaps Xander seeing her potential when no one else could? Ready for your next escape into paranormal romance? We've crafted dozens of tales featuring strong heroines, protective alphas, and love stories that defy every obstacle. Don't miss out on future adventures. Subscribe and turn on notifications to join thousands of romance lovers who trust us to deliver their next favorite story. Your next obsession is just one click away. Thanks for spending your evening with us in this world.